All right, let's jump right in. Tucked away near the very end of the New Testament, there's this short, kind of strange, and incredibly intense letter, the letter of Jude. It is just packed with fiery warnings, obscure references, and some really vivid imagery. And it's all aimed at this mysterious threat that's popped up from inside the community. So today, we're going to decode this urgent, ancient message.
Right off the bat, Jude does not pull any punches. He opens with this really ominous warning, and he's painting a picture not of some enemy outside the walls, but of a hidden threat, an internal one. These aren't invaders at the gate. These are people who have quietly, secretly, kind of weaseled their way right into the heart of everything.
So this immediately brings up the big questions that are going to drive this whole letter. And honestly, our whole investigation here. Just who were these people? And what exactly made them so incredibly dangerous? Let's dig in and find out.
To really feel the intensity of this letter, you've got to understand something. This wasn't the letter Jude even wanted to write. He tells his audience flat out that he was all set to write about their shared salvation, the good stuff. But he had to slam on the brakes and pivot to deal with this immediate, pressing crisis. Something was going very, very wrong, and it just couldn't wait.
And here it is. This is the heart of the problem. Jude never actually names these opponents, but he's crystal clear about their mistake. They had taken this core Christian idea of God's grace, this beautiful concept of unearned forgiveness, and just twisted it into something totally unrecognizable. For them, it wasn't about the power to live a new, transformed life. Nope, it was a get-out-of-jail-free card, a license to indulge every single craving they had, with no consequences. So when he's faced with this crisis, how does Jude fight back? Well, he doesn't just start barking orders. Instead, he builds this powerful, persuasive case. It's like he has this sophisticated rhetorical strategy to expose the interlopers and rally his community. Let's break down his playbook.
Now, this is really interesting. Back in the ancient world, scholars tell us there were two main types of letters that are relevant here. You had your advisory letter, which was all about persuading people to do something, and then you had the vituperative letter, which was basically a full-on character takedown. And what Jude does is he masterfully blends the two. He's advising his flock to fight for their faith, and at the exact same time, he's launching this blistering attack on the character of these infiltrators. This is Jude's go-to move, his main tactic. He acts like a prosecutor in a courtroom. He doesn't just stand up and say, hey, these people are bad. No. He lays out the historical precedent. He shows example after example of what has happened every single time people have behaved this way before. He's literally building his case on this clear pattern of divine judgment throughout all of history. All right, so let's open the case file. Jude pulls out three huge historical precedents, right? Three major exhibits from sacred history that he believes are a perfect mirror for what these interlopers are doing. And, more importantly, he thinks they predict their ultimate fate. Okay, Exhibit A. Jude's first piece of evidence is a story his audience would have known inside and out, the generation that came out of Egypt in the Exodus. I mean, just think about how powerful this example would have been for them. These early Christians saw themselves as a new Israel, rescued from spiritual slavery. So a story about the original Israel, that's a direct and serious warning. This was the group that saw God's miracles. They walked through the Red Sea on dry land. They were fed by God in the desert. And yet, right on the edge of getting everything they were promised, they balked. They chose fear over faith. And because of that distrust, they were condemned to die in the wilderness. The message here is so clear. Being delivered doesn't mean a thing if you turn your back on the one who delivered you. Now for Exhibit B, Jude reaches even farther back in time. He pulls from a story that was really popular in his day, one that you find in Genesis and in other texts like the Book of 1 Enoch. He's talking about the rebel angels. This story is all about one thing: crossing boundaries. In Jude's time, people wondered a lot about where evil came from, and this tale of divine beings abandoning their proper place to meddle with humanity was a pretty well-known explanation. They unleashed chaos and violence on the world, and their punishment was severe, chained up in darkness, just waiting for the final judgment. So for Jude, these interlopers were doing the exact same thing, crossing God-given moral and spiritual boundaries. Jude's third and final exhibit is probably the most famous example of divine judgment in the entire Old Testament. Yep, He's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and Jude zooms in on a very specific part of their sin. He says they went after a different kind of flesh, and he's drawing a direct line from them back to the rebel angels. For Jude, the critical point once again is this transgression of created boundaries, and their shocking, fiery end serves as this unforgettable public service announcement about the consequences. Okay, so as if the letter wasn't strange enough already, Jude then dives into some even more obscure references. I mean, these are the real deep cuts, the kind of clues that would have been obvious to his first-century audience, but can kind of leave us just scratching our heads. This right here is probably the most famous oddity in the entire letter. Jude just casually drops this reference to a fight between Michael the Archangel and the devil over the body of Moses. It comes out of absolutely nowhere, it refers to a story that's been lost to time, and it just makes you go, wait, what is this about, and why on earth is it here?
Okay, so here's the crucial point. In the story, Jude is talking about Michael, who is one of the most powerful beings in all of creation, gets into a conflict with Satan. But, and this is the key part, instead of arrogantly telling the devil off on his own authority, he defers to God. He simply says, "May the Lord rebuke you." Jude uses this as a stunning counterexample, right? Even an archangel shows restraint and respect for authority, while these arrogant interlopers, they just slander and dismiss authority without a second thought. You know, speaking of Jude's specific references, there's a fascinating little detail in his very first piece of evidence that we looked at. If you line up a few different Bibles and look at Jude verse 5, you might notice something weird. The wording isn't always the same. And this little detail opens up the incredible world of textual criticism and shows us just how tricky it was to preserve these ancient texts.
See, we don't actually have the original documents, the autographs of any book in the New Testament. What we have are thousands of copies, all made by hand. And scribes, well, they're human. They made mistakes. Sometimes it was just an accidental slip of the eye, but other times they made intentional corrections to maybe smooth out some grammar or make a verse match up with another one. So the work of textual critics today is to sift through all this evidence to try and figure out what the original most likely said. And look at this. This is a real-world example from that very verse, Jude 5. Our earliest and best ancient manuscripts actually disagree on who delivered Israel from Egypt. Was it the Lord, like it says in Codex Sinaiticus? Or was it Jesus, like in Codex Vaticanus? Or maybe even God Christ, like you see in Papyrus 72? It's a little messy, but it's also an amazing window into how these texts were passed down. It shows that some of the earliest Christians clearly believed that the pre-incarnate Jesus was active in Israel's history. Okay, so let's pull back from the tiny textual details and get to Jude's final verdict. After laying out all of his historical evidence, he just unleashes this barrage of vivid metaphors to basically summarize the character and the fate of these interlopers. I mean, these images are just devastating. The interlopers aren't just wrong, he says. They're dangerous, like hidden reefs that can completely shipwreck your faith. They're selfish, like shepherds who only feed themselves. And ultimately, they're empty. They are clouds with no rain, trees with no fruit, wandering stars with no fixed position. They offer nothing of substance, and they are destined for darkness. And this brings us to the real core of Jude's warning, a message that I think still resonates so much today. He argues that these interlopers, in their chase for what they think is freedom, are actually corrupting themselves. They're casting off reason and tradition, and in doing so, he says they are becoming like unreasoning animals, just driven by instinct and craving. It's this powerful claim that in trying to live a fuller life, we can actually end up becoming less than fully human. So in the end, Jude's short, intense little letter leaves us with this profound and honestly timeless question. It forces every generation of people to ask, in our own lives, in our own communities, where do we draw the line? What's the real difference between healthy spiritual freedom and a dangerous license that ultimately just leads to ruin? It's definitely a question worth pondering.